A millionaire marries a poor and ugly gardener to get revenge on his ex, but on the wedding night, he is shocked to discover that Thomas Brown gazed at the panoramic view of Seattle from his penthouse. The city never slept, just like him. The luxurious life he had built was the result of hard work, calculated decisions, and an insatiable hunger for power. But that night, nothing sparkled enough to extinguish the fire of rage burning in his chest. Rebecca Lewis, his fiancée, had destroyed everything he believed about trust and love. Months ago, she had betrayed him, leaving him for a rival businessman, someone who offered less stability but more excitement, as she had put it. Thomas let out a bitter laugh. Excitement. He had dedicated himself to building a perfect future for both of them, only to be discarded like a pawn on a chessboard. It wasn't the abandonment that gnawed at him, it was the public humiliation it represented. For weeks he replayed the events in his mind, but that night he decided it was time to act. Rebecca needed to see that not only had he moved past the betrayal, but he had found something far better. His plan was simple. Marry someone who was the exact opposite of Rebecca, a humble woman from modest origins, someone who would contrast sharply with his ex-fiancée's artificiality. It was perfect, a marriage not out of love, but revenge. The next morning, Thomas strolled through the sprawling grounds of his mansion. The scent of freshly planted flowers filled the air, and the sound of birds seemed to mock his restlessness. That's when he saw her, Sarah Cooper, the gardener. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in soil as she trimmed the leaves of a small shrub. The simplicity of her movements caught his attention. Her face was illuminated by the sun, and the dedication she showed to her work was captivating. Thomas stopped a few meters away, silently watching her. "Good morning, Mr. Brown," she said, her voice gentle and polite, breaking the silence. "Good morning, Sarah," he replied, her name rolling off his tongue with more curiosity than he intended. "How long have you been working here?" "Almost 2 years, sir. I've been taking care of the garden since it was renovated." He nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. Sarah had something Rebecca never did: authenticity. Her demeanor was simple, yet full of dignity. She was the perfect choice. In the days that followed, Thomas began to approach Sarah more often. Casual conversations about the garden became more frequent, and he learned more about her life. She was an only child, taking care of her sick mother, who relied on expensive medical treatments. Sarah worked tirelessly to support her household without complaint. One afternoon, as she organized her tools, Thomas decided to act. "Sarah, may I talk to you about something important?" he began, his voice firm but slightly hesitant. "Of course, Mr. Brown." Thomas took a deep breath. "I need your help with a personal project." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of project?" "I want to get married," he said bluntly, watching the surprise flash in her eyes. "To me?" Her voice was filled with incredulity. She laughed nervously, thinking it was a cruel joke. "Yes," Thomas replied firmly, "but it's not what you think. It won't be a traditional marriage." He explained his plan in a cold and calculated manner. Sarah would be his wife by contract, a facade to show Rebecca that he had moved on and was thriving without her. In return, he would ensure her mother received complete medical care and provide a generous financial compensation. "This isn't right," Sarah responded, crossing her arms. "You want to use people to get back at someone else." "It's not that simple," Thomas retorted, keeping his composure. "I need this, and you need money for your mother. It's a deal." "A hollow deal," she countered, her tone firm and her eyes serious. Thomas knew convincing Sarah wouldn't be easy. She had principles that wouldn't bend easily, but he was also aware of her difficult circumstances. That night, he had a detailed medical report from specialists sent to her home, along with a letter reiterating the terms of their agreement. The next day, Sarah arrived at the mansion with the envelope in hand. "You're a cold man, Mr. Brown," she said, staring directly at him, "but I won't let my mother suffer because of my pride. I accept, but let's be clear, I'm only doing this for her." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "It'll be good for both of us, trust me." She let out a humorless laugh. "Trust you? That's asking too much." With the contract signed, the plan was set in motion. Thomas believed he had everything under control. Sarah, however, felt a mix of relief and unease. As she returned to her work in the garden, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something far bigger than she could imagine. Thomas watched Sarah from his window. She was the perfect piece for his game. What he didn't know yet was that by playing with fate, he was opening the door to changes that even he, with all his control, couldn't predict. The event hall was filled with shimmering lights and the characteristic buzz of Seattle's elite. Every detail had been meticulously planned by Thomas Brown. The extravagant buffet, the impeccable decor, and the atmosphere carefully designed to impress. That night wasn't just a party, it was a public statement. He was back in the game, and this time with a fiancée who defied everyone's expectations. When Sarah walked into the room beside Thomas, the atmosphere seemed to shift. All eyes turned toward the couple, and the momentary silence was replaced by hushed murmurs. She wore a simple blue dress that highlighted her natural beauty but stood out against the excessive glamour of the other women present. Her hair was tied back modestly, and her posture conveyed a nervousness she struggled to hide. "Remember, Sarah," Thomas murmured close to her ear as they walked. "Just smile, and I'll handle the rest." She forced a smile, but felt the weight of every gaze fixed on her. It was as if she were being judged by a silent jury, where the verdict already seemed decided, unfit. Among the guests, Rebecca Lewis stood out. She wore a bold red dress, practically a warning that she wouldn't go unnoticed. When her eyes met Thomas's, the malicious smile that crossed her lips made it clear she was ready for a confrontation. "Thomas, darling," Rebecca approached, holding a glass of champagne. Her tone was sweet, but her words dripped with venom. "What a surprise to see you looking so refreshed." "Rebecca," Thomas replied coolly, "I see you haven't changed a bit." She laughed, ignoring his sharp tone. "And this is your fiancé?" Rebecca turned to Sarah, giving her a once-over. "What an interesting choice." Sarah felt her face flush, but before she could say anything, Thomas intervened. "Sarah is everything I could ever want in a wife. Authentic, loyal, and above all, real." The comment cut into Rebecca's ego like a knife. She managed a tight smile, but her eyes burned with resentment. As the evening progressed, Sarah tried to blend in with the guests, but the conversations often circled around veiled questions or passive-aggressive remarks. "So, you worked as a gardener?" one woman with an affected voice asked, her smile insincere. "Yes," Sarah replied, lifting her chin. "An honest job I've always been proud of." Her direct response caught the woman off guard, who quickly changed the subject. Sarah realized that although she felt out of place, her authenticity was beginning to win over a few of the guests. From a corner of the room, Thomas observed everything. He had expected Sarah to falter or make some misstep, but instead he saw a woman who, despite her nerves, displayed courage and dignity. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. She wasn't just there to play a role, she was starting to stand out on her own. However, the tension of the evening peaked when Rebecca approached Thomas again. "Can I steal a moment of your time?" she asked, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. He followed her out onto a balcony, away from prying eyes. Once they were alone, Rebecca dropped her mask. "So, this is what you do now? Lower yourself to this level just to provoke me?" "This has nothing to do with you, Rebecca," Thomas replied, keeping his composure. "Oh, please," she scoffed, crossing her arms. "Do you really think you're fooling anyone? This sham of a marriage, that girl doesn't belong in our world, and you know it." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "What bothers you so much, Rebecca? The fact that I'm happy, or the fact that you no longer have any power over me?" Rebecca stepped closer, her eyes blazing with anger. "You can pretend all you want, Thomas, but deep down, you know I'm still the only one who truly understands you." "You're wrong," he said firmly, "and this conversation is over." When Thomas returned to the hall, he found Sarah near the drinks table, holding a glass of juice. She looked relieved to see him, but there was something in her eyes that made him pause. "Are you all right?" he asked, stepping closer. "Surviving," she replied with a faint smile. He wanted to say something more, perhaps a word of reassurance, but he held back. In that moment, Thomas began to realize that Sarah wasn't as fragile as she appeared, and it intrigued him in ways he wasn't yet prepared to admit. The party went on late into the night, but the seeds of change had already been planted. While Sarah braced herself for the challenging journey ahead, Thomas was starting to see that his plan might be far more complicated than he had imagined. As for Rebecca, she wouldn't give up so easily, fanning the flames of a fire that threatened to consume them all. Thomas Brown's mansion was immense, almost like a modern castle, but to Sarah Cooper it felt more like a cold and oppressive labyrinth. Every perfectly lit corridor and every immaculate piece of furniture served as a reminder that this place was not her home. It was Sarah's first official day living as Thomas's wife, and she already felt the weight of her new reality. The discomfort began early that morning when she came down for breakfast. The table was far too long, decorated with exotic fruits and refined dishes she couldn't even identify. "Good morning, Mrs. Brown," said a stern-looking housekeeper, her formal tone more of a warning. Sarah would be watched and judged by everyone. She smiled, trying to mask her nervousness. "Good morning." As she sat down, she noticed the exchanged glances among the staff. They weren't used to seeing her in this role. To them, she was still the gardener, someone who belonged outside among the flowers, not at the main table. Thomas entered the room, dressed in his usual impeccable suit. He seemed as at ease as Sarah felt out of place. "I hope you slept well," he said while pouring himself a cup of coffee. "It was different," she replied, unsure how to describe the sensation of being surrounded by such luxury, yet feeling so out of place. He nodded absent-mindedly, already engrossed in his phone, reading and replying to messages. For Thomas, this marriage was still a transaction, and Sarah had a role to play. "We have an event tonight," he said without looking up. "You'll need to be prepared." "An event? What kind of event?" "A dinner with some important associates. I need you to look comfortable, confident." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that?" Thomas finally looked at her, as if registering the real question behind her words. He exhaled. "Just be polite and smile." Sarah bit back a sharp reply and finished her coffee in silence. Throughout the day, Sarah tried to establish some sort of routine in the mansion. However, every attempt was a reminder that she didn't belong there. The staff were professional, but many treated her with forced respect, almost as if they were waiting for her to make a mistake. In the living room, a maid was cleaning the vases while whispering something to another, unaware that Sarah was nearby. "I don't know how she managed it. Marrying him," one of them said. "It must be temporary. There's no way he's serious about this," the other replied with a quiet laugh. Sarah felt her face burn, but she walked away. It wasn't the first time she'd overheard such comments since the marriage was announced, but the humiliation was still hard to bear. When evening came, the dinner was yet another test of her patience. She wore a dress chosen by the stylist Thomas had hired. Something elegant and expensive, but that didn't feel like her. During the event, Sarah smiled and engaged in polite conversations with the guests, but her discomfort was evident. At one point, she accidentally spilled a little wine on the table. One of the associates made a sarcastic joke, and Thomas didn't miss the opportunity to correct her discreetly. "Be more careful," he whispered coldly. "I'm not a perfect doll, Thomas," she replied, looking him directly in the eye. He didn't respond, but the tension between them was palpable. Later, when they returned to the mansion, Sarah couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. "I get it now. You just want me as a trophy to show off," she said, facing Thomas in the living room. "But that doesn't mean you get to treat me like I'm less than you." Thomas stared at her, surprised by her boldness. "This isn't about that. You knew what you were getting into when you agreed to this marriage." "Knew?" She let out a bitter laugh. "All you did was use my need against me. You don't care about who I am as long as I serve your plan." "And what's wrong with that?" he shot back, his voice rising. "You knew the terms. Why does it bother you now?" "Because I'm not like you, Thomas," Sarah said, stepping closer. "I care, I feel, and if you can't see people beyond how they serve your goals, then you're the one who's losing." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Thomas remained silent, his hands clenched into fists. For the first time, he didn't have a response. Sarah turned and walked to her room, leaving Thomas alone in the living room. He sat on the sofa, his thoughts in turmoil. The truth was, Sarah was right, but he didn't know how to handle it. She was more than just a piece in his game, and the idea that she could challenge him was both infuriating and fascinating. That night they slept in separate rooms, but the tension between them wouldn't be easy to resolve. The battle had begun, and neither of them was willing to back down anytime soon. The car glided smoothly along the road as silence reigned between Thomas and Sarah. Their destination was a luxurious charity event on the coast, a fundraiser for an educational foundation. Despite her usual discomfort being around Thomas, Sarah couldn't deny that something felt different during this trip. The usual tension seemed to have lessened, and she decided to focus on the scenery, avoiding any unnecessary interaction. "You're awfully quiet," Thomas broke the silence, his eyes fixed on the road. "Is that a problem?" Sarah replied, raising an eyebrow. He let out a soft sigh. "No, I just thought you might have questions about the event." "I don't have any, but thank you for your concern," she shot back, her voice dripping with irony. Thomas suppressed a smile. She always had a sharp response, something he was beginning to find, oddly enough, refreshing. When they arrived at the hotel, Sarah was shown to the room Thomas had reserved for her. It was a sophisticated suite, complete with a balcony offering a stunning view of the ocean. She was mesmerized by the beauty of the place, but she reminded herself not to get carried away. Later, as they prepared for the event, Sarah chose a dress that combined simplicity and elegance, something that highlighted her natural charm. When she descended to the lobby and met Thomas, she noticed the fleeting look of surprise he tried to mask. "You look very nice," he commented curtly, though there was an unsettling sincerity in his tone. She simply nodded. "Thank you." The ballroom was a display of opulence. Men in flawless suits and women adorned with extravagant jewelry mingled, exchanging pleasantries with false smiles. Sarah felt the familiar discomfort growing in her chest, but took a deep breath, determined to face the night with dignity. As the two moved through the crowd, Sarah noticed that Thomas seemed more relaxed than usual. He wasn't pressuring her as he had before, which allowed her to let her guard down slightly. During a break for drinks, they sat at a secluded table where, for the first time, the conversation took an unexpected turn. "What was your life like before all of this?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. Sarah hesitated. "Simple. I grew up in a humble neighborhood. My father passed away when I was young, so my mum and I had to figure things out on our own. I started working early to help her." She paused, her gaze fixed on the glass in front of her. "When she got sick, things became harder, But I did what I had to do to take care of her." Thomas watched her intently as she spoke. There was something in her voice that conveyed strength, even as she recounted her struggles. "And you?" she asked, shifting the focus. "What was it like growing up with all of this?" Thomas gave a bitter smile. "Growing up with money and high expectations isn't as simple as it looks. My father always pushed me to be perfect. When he died, I had to take over everything, even though I wasn't ready." He paused, something rare for him. "And then came Rebecca. I thought I finally had something that was mine, not about business or responsibilities, but I was wrong." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She saw something in Thomas she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. Behind the facade of control and arrogance was a man carrying more weight than he wanted to admit. "Sounds like we both had to grow up too fast," she remarked softly. Thomas looked at her, surprised by the empathy in her voice. For the first time, he felt like someone truly saw him. Their growing connection was interrupted when Rebecca entered the ballroom, drawing everyone's attention. She walked confidently toward Thomas and Sarah, a sharp smile on her lips and a provocative glint in her eyes. "Sarah," Rebecca began, feigning a friendly tone, "you look lovely tonight. Thomas does have good taste after all." "Rebecca," Sarah replied with a calm smile, "you also look striking." Rebecca let out a light laugh, but there was venom in her expression. "Tell me, it must be such a huge change for you, going from gardener to the wife of a magnate. I hope it's not too hard to keep up." Sarah took a deep breath. She knew it was a provocation, but she decided not to back down. "It's true, it's a big change, but I believe authenticity always stands out, no matter the setting." Rebecca narrowed her eyes, feeling disarmed by Sarah's poised response. Before she could retort, Thomas stepped in. "Rebecca, why don't you enjoy the party somewhere else? I'm sure you'll find someone willing to entertain your insinuations." She shot Sarah a final glare before walking away, visibly irritated. Sarah, though nervous, maintained her composure. When she looked at Thomas, she noticed a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "Well played," he said with a faint smile. "I won't stoop to her level," Sarah replied firmly. "No matter what happens, I won't let anyone disrespect me." Thomas didn't respond, but in that moment something shifted within him. Sarah was far more than just a piece in the game he had crafted. She was strong, authentic, and, above all, unpredictable. As the night went on, Thomas found himself thinking that perhaps Sarah wasn't just an ally in his quest for revenge. Maybe she was exactly what he needed to rediscover something he had long lost, a real reason to move forward. The morning began like any other for Sarah, with sunlight filtering through the mansion's massive windows. She was in the garden, the only place where she still felt at ease, when the housekeeper approached with an unreadable expression and handed her an envelope. "This arrived for you, Mrs. Brown." Sarah noticed the absence of a sender. Upon opening it, she found a plain sheet of paper with a message that made her stomach churn. "You will never be one of us. Stop pretending before it's too late." The words, written in an elegant but ruthless script, echoed in her mind. She took a deep breath, trying to contain her fear and indignation. The last thing she wanted was for Thomas to find out. He would see it as a sign of weakness or, worse, use it against her. Sarah tucked the note away in a drawer in her bedroom, determined to ignore the provocation. However, it wouldn't be the last message. In the days that followed, more envelopes arrived, each crueler than the last. The messages insinuated that she was an imposter, a fraud, someone who would never be worthy of the Brown name. Despite the growing discomfort, Sarah maintained her composure. She knew that Thomas's world was full of power plays, and showing vulnerability would be dangerous. While Sarah dealt with the messages, Rebecca made a point of being a constant presence. She appeared at the same events as Thomas and Sarah, always with subtle remarks aimed at Sarah. One afternoon, Rebecca showed up unannounced at Thomas's office, claiming to have urgent matters to discuss about an old business partnership. "Thomas, we need to talk," Rebecca began, crossing her legs as she settled into the chair across from him. "Make it quick, Rebecca." "I'm busy," he replied, without looking up from the papers on his desk. Rebecca smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know that's not true. You're busy trying to convince everyone, and yourself, that you're happy with that woman." Thomas looked up, his gaze cold. "What do you want?" "I'm just concerned about you," she said, feigning innocence. "Everyone knows Sarah doesn't belong in this world. She's going to drag you down, Thomas. There's still time to fix this." "Fix what?" he retorted, crossing his arms. "Do you think you can just erase what you did and come back as if nothing happened?" Rebecca leaned forward, her gaze seductive. "You know you still think about me. This marriage is a lie, and you know it." "You're wrong," he replied firmly. "And now, if you have nothing else to say, I suggest you leave." Rebecca left, frustrated but not defeated. Thomas knew she would try again. One night, while Sarah was asleep, Thomas entered her room to retrieve a document he had accidentally left there. Opening a drawer, he found the anonymous envelopes. He read the messages and felt something he hadn't expected: anger. Thomas descended the stairs to his office, holding the notes as he reflected. He recognized the cruelty in those words because deep down, he knew it was something he himself might have used against an enemy. But Sarah was not his enemy. The next morning, over breakfast, Thomas broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" he asked, placing the notes on the table. Sarah froze, her face flushing with both shame and indignation. "Because it's none of your business," she replied, reaching for the papers. He caught her hand, stopping her. "It is my business. You're my wife, Sarah. This affects me too." "It's not a real marriage, remember?" she shot back, her voice heavy with emotion. "Why would you care?" Thomas hesitated. He didn't have a simple answer. He didn't know why he cared, but the thought of someone attacking Sarah left him unsettled. "I'm not going to let anyone treat you like this," he said finally, "no matter what you think about us." She looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. For the first time, Sarah felt that perhaps Thomas was beginning to see her as more than just a piece on the chessboard. A few days later, at another social event, tensions came to a head. Rebecca, as usual, seized the opportunity to take jabs at Sarah, making comments about her background in front of other guests. "It's admirable how well you've adapted to this world, Sarah," Rebecca said with a sweet smile. "I, personally, would find it intimidating." Before Sarah could respond, Thomas stepped in. He put his arm around Sarah and fixed Rebecca with an icy stare. "You're right, Rebecca. It is intimidating. But Sarah is stronger than anyone here, stronger than you ever were." The room fell silent. No one had expected Thomas, known for his cold demeanor, to defend Sarah so publicly and directly. Rebecca was speechless, her confidence shaken by Thomas's firm words. Sarah, on the other hand, felt a mix of relief and confusion. While she knew Thomas was still a calculating man, this moment felt different. He wasn't just protecting his image, he was defending her. That night, as they returned home, Sarah thanked Thomas. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied, looking her in the eyes. "I won't allow anyone to disrespect you." She felt the warmth in his words, but she wasn't sure if she could fully trust him. Even so, something was changing. Both of them knew it, but neither was ready to admit it. The game Thomas had started was beginning to slip out of his control, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the consequences. Sarah was sitting on the small sofa in the bedroom she occupied in the mansion, staring at the result of the pregnancy test in her hands. The two pink lines seemed to scream at her. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind struggled to process what it meant. Pregnant. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if that could change the reality. A mix of emotions overwhelmed her: fear, uncertainty, but also a flicker of happiness she hadn't expected to feel. Ever since agreeing to marry Thomas, her life had been a roller coaster of challenges. A child was the last thing she had imagined or wanted at this moment, especially given the circumstances of her life. For hours, Sarah debated how to tell Thomas. He was a calculating man, obsessed with control. What would he think upon learning he was about to become a father? She feared he would see the pregnancy as an inconvenience, or worse, as an attempt to trap him in a relationship that, from the start, had been nothing more than a contract. Later that day, Thomas returned to the mansion after a long meeting. He found Sarah in the garden, sitting on a wooden bench under the shade of a tree. Her face was pale, and there was something different in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" he asked, noticing her unusual demeanor. Sarah hesitated. She wasn't sure how to approach the subject. "We need to talk," she finally said, looking up at him. "This sounds serious," he replied, his expression growing more rigid. She took a deep breath, summoning courage. I'm pregnant." The impact of those words was immediate. For a moment, Thomas said nothing, as if the information was hard to process. His face became a mask of conflicting emotions: surprise, doubt, fear, and something else he couldn't name. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "I am," Sarah replied, crossing her arms as though shielding herself. The silence that followed was unbearable for her. Thomas began pacing back and forth, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on planning every step of his life, and this was something that wasn't part of any plan. "What are we going to do?" he finally asked, stopping to face her. "I'm going to have this baby," Sarah said firmly, "but I don't expect anything from you, Thomas. I don't want you to think I'm using this as a way to manipulate you." Those words hit him hard. He knew Sarah wasn't that kind of person, but the idea that anyone might think so irritated him deeply. "Don't say that," he replied, his tone serious. "This child is mine too, and I will take responsibility." Adit. Her gaze softened, but there was still caution in her posture. She didn't know if she could fully trust that promise. In the days that followed, Thomas tried to adapt to the idea of becoming a father. He didn't know how to handle the flood of emotions he felt, but at the same time, he realized that Sarah's pregnancy had brought something unexpected, a new perspective. For the first time in years, he began to question his priorities and the emptiness of his relentless pursuit of revenge. But not everything would be smooth. Rebecca, as always, kept a close watch on everything happening in Thomas's life. When she heard rumors about Sarah's pregnancy, she saw it as an opportunity to destabilize their relationship. At a social event, Rebecca approached Thomas with her usual air of superiority. "Congratulations, Thomas," she said, her tone sweet, but her words dripping with venom. "I hear you're going to be a father. Seems Sarah is cleverer than I thought." He narrowed his eyes. "What are you trying to say?" "Oh, nothing. I just find it curious how quickly she got pregnant, don't you?" Rebecca teased, tilting her head theatrically. "Watch what you say, Rebecca," Thomas replied, his tone low and threatening. "I'm just saying, some women know how to secure their position. A baby always changes the rules of the game, doesn't it?" Thomas remained silent, but his fists clenched tightly. He knew Rebecca was trying to plant doubts in his mind, but for the first time he realized just how insignificant her games were. Later that night, back at the mansion, he found Sarah in her room. She was sitting on the bed holding a book, but she seemed distracted. "Rebecca knows," he said bluntly. Sarah looked up at him, surprised. "How did she find out?" "That doesn't matter," he replied, sitting beside her. "What matters is that she's going to try to use it against you." She sighed, feeling the weight of the situation. "Of course she will. All she wants is to destroy us." "She won't succeed," Thomas said, his voice filled with determination. Sarah looked at him, surprised by the firmness in his expression. Despite all the fears and uncertainties still lingering between them, she felt that, for the first time, Thomas was genuinely committed to something beyond his revenge. The pregnancy had changed everything. It brought challenges, but also the possibility of a new beginning. And while they were still navigating turbulent waters, there was something in the air that suggested that together they could face whatever came their way. The afternoon was grey when Thomas received a message from Rebecca requesting a meeting. He knew it was risky to accept, but something about her choice of words, to settle unfinished business, piqued his curiosity. As much as he was aware that Rebecca was a master manipulator, part of him wanted to believe this meeting could be the closure he had long sought to bury. They arranged to meet at a sophisticated, secluded restaurant far from prying eyes. Thomas arrived first, as usual, and sat at a corner table where he could observe the entrance. Outwardly calm, his mind raced, analyzing what Rebecca might want this time. She arrived a few minutes later, exuding confidence in a dress that seemed deliberately chosen to impress. The smile on her face was familiar, but this time it stirred none of the emotions it once did in Thomas. "Thomas," she said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "Thank you for coming." "Get to the point, Rebecca," he replied bluntly, with no intention of prolonging the conversation. Rebecca leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "No need to be so cold. I thought after everything we deserved an honest conversation." "Honest?" He raised an eyebrow. "Honesty was never your strong suit, Rebecca." She laughed, trying to maintain her composure. "I know I made mistakes, but we're human, aren't we? We make mistakes and can still redeem ourselves." "Is that a speech, or are you trying to justify something?" he shot back, crossing his arms. Rebecca paused, studying him. For the first time, she noticed that Thomas wasn't playing her game. He didn't seem hurt or resentful, just indifferent. "I still care about you," she said, softening her tone. Thomas scoffed, unconvinced. "If you cared, you wouldn't have betrayed me." "It was a mistake!" Rebecca exclaimed, the first crack in her mask. "I was confused, and you were so focused on work, so distant." "This isn't about what I did or didn't do, Rebecca," he cut her off, his voice low but sharp. "You chose to betray me, and it wasn't just me. It was what we had, what we built." Rebecca averted her gaze for a moment, but quickly regained her composure. "And now you're with Sarah, a woman who has no idea what it's like to live in this world. She's convenient." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Don't talk about her." "Why not?" "Because you know it's true." Rebecca pressed, leaning in again. "Thomas, look at me. You and I are the same. Sarah doesn't understand your ambition, your need for control. She won't last." The silence that followed was heavy. Rebecca expected her words to plant some doubt, but to her surprise, Thomas smiled, a cold, almost pitying smile. "You know what's funny, Rebecca?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "For the longest time, I thought I needed you. I thought your betrayal was proof that I wasn't good enough." Rebecca tensed, unsure where he was going with this. "But now I see that my obsession wasn't love. It was ego," he continued, his eyes locked on hers. "I wanted to prove something because I couldn't stand the idea of losing. But today, you mean nothing to me." The words landed like a bomb. Rebecca tried to hide her frustration, but couldn't stop the tremor in her hands. "You can't be serious," she whispered, almost desperate. "I'm more serious than ever," Thomas replied, standing up. "Our past is over, Rebecca, and my present is with Sarah." Rebecca froze as he reached into his pocket, ready to leave. But before he could walk away, She played her final card. "What if everyone knew the truth about your marriage?" she said, her voice dripping with venom. Thomas stopped, but didn't turn around. "What do you think will happen when people find out it was all an arrangement? That Sarah is only with you because you bought her?" He turned slowly, his eyes colder than ever. "If you think you can threaten me with that, you're more desperate than I thought." "You have a lot to lose, Thomas," Rebecca countered, trying to recover her confidence. "And you have nothing to gain," he replied, walking away without looking back. Rebecca remained alone at the table, feeling the weight of her defeat. For the first time, she realized that Thomas was no longer the man she once knew. He had changed, and the control she once held over him was gone. Back at the mansion, Thomas found Sarah in the garden, watering some plants. When she saw him, she noticed the tension in his shoulders. "Did something happen?" she asked, setting the watering can aside. He hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Rebecca tried to threaten us." Sarah crossed her arms. "What does she want now?" "Nothing she can get," he replied, looking at her in a way that made her both uncomfortable and curious. "I told you I can handle this on my own. I don't need you to—" "Sarah," he interrupted, his voice softer than usual. "You don't have to handle this alone." She stared at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. Despite all the doubts she still harbored about him, she felt that there was something genuine there. That night, as Thomas reflected on the day's events, he realized that something inside him had shifted. For the first time, he wasn't consumed by the past. For the first time, he wanted something real, and that something was beginning to take shape with Sarah by his side. The morning was unusually quiet in the Brown mansion. Sarah sat at the breakfast table, flipping through a gardening magazine as she tried to push away the unease she had been feeling over the past few days. Something felt off. The silence was abruptly broken by a sudden call on Thomas's phone, which was sitting at the other end of the table. He answered quickly, and the alarm in his voice immediately caught Sarah's attention. "How did this get to the press?" he demanded, standing up. "Find out who leaked it and fix it. Now!" Sarah watched the scene unfold, confused and worried. Thomas ended the call and looked at her, his face tense and troubled. "What happened?" she asked hesitantly. "It's about us," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Someone leaked our contract to the media." The words hit Sarah like a blow. She tried to process what that meant, but before she could react, her phone buzzed. Notifications of messages, missed calls, and news links flooded the screen. The sham marriage of magnate Thomas Brown and former gardener Sarah Cooper. Financial arrangement or true love? Sources reveal it all started with a contract. Sarah's stomach churned as she read the headlines. The details of their arrangement were exposed in raw terms, filled with demeaning comments about her and cruel speculations about her intentions. "It was Rebecca," Sarah said, her voice low but filled with certainty. "All signs point to her," Thomas replied, "but we'll handle it. I'll deal with the lawyers and the journalists." "Handle it?" Sarah repeated, incredulous. "You think you can control what people are saying about me, about us?" Thomas tried to approach her, but she stepped back. "You knew this could happen," she continued, her voice trembling. "From the beginning, you played with my life like I was just another piece on your chessboard." "I never wanted this to happen," Thomas said earnestly. "I'll protect you and the baby, no matter what it takes." "Protect?" She let out a bitter laugh. "The only thing you've ever protected is your ego." Without waiting for a response, Sarah left the room and headed to her bedroom. There, she began packing a suitcase, her hands shaking as she folded clothes and grabbed essentials. Thomas found her shortly after. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'm leaving," she replied without looking at him. "You can't leave," Thomas said, stepping closer. "Sarah, not now, not alone." "I can't stay here," she said, finally facing him. "All I ever wanted was to care for my mother and live a simple life." But you dragged me into your world, exposed me, and now I'm a target. I'll fix this, he insisted. Trust me. Trust? She said, tears streaming down her face. How can I trust you, Thomas? He stood in silence, unable to answer. Sarah closed the suitcase and walked past him. He tried to stop her, but she was resolute. I need to think about my child and my dignity, and here I have neither. She walked out the front door of the mansion, leaving Thomas standing alone, staring at the emptiness she left behind. In the days that followed, the scandal grew. The press was relentless, and Thomas's image took hit after hit, but none of that mattered to him. The only thought consuming him was Sarah. He tried to contact her, but she didn't answer his calls. Thomas knew he had crossed the line, that his obsession with revenge had destroyed something that could have been real. Finally, he decided to step away from the control and strategies that had always governed his life. On a rainy morning, he drove to the modest apartment Sarah had rented in a humble neighborhood. Sarah greeted him with surprise and suspicion, but before she could tell him to leave, he began to speak. I was wrong, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. From the beginning, I used you as part of a selfish plan, and that was unforgivable. But Sarah, you've changed everything. She crossed her arms, looking at him skeptically. I'm not here to justify what I did, he continued. I'm here to say that you are the strongest, most genuine person I've ever met, and for the first time in my life, I want something real. I want you. Sarah remained silent, surprised by Thomas's vulnerability. I don't expect you to forgive me right now, he said, but I'm going to fight for you. For us. She looked at him, her conflicting emotions clear on her face. Despite everything, there was something about Thomas's sincerity that made her believe he had truly changed. This won't be easy, she said finally. I don't expect it to be, he replied. I just want the chance to try. Sarah sighed, still hesitant, but for the first time since leaving the mansion, she felt a spark of hope. The truth had come to light, but now they had the chance to build something stronger than any lie. The light rain fell over the city as Thomas watched the activity outside the building where Sarah was living. He was no longer the man who thought he could control everything around him. Losing Sarah had taught him that rebuilding what he had broken would require more than words. It would require action. In the days following their conversation at her apartment, Thomas distanced himself from his usual world. For the first time, he delegated responsibilities at the company and immersed himself in figuring out how to show Sarah that his intentions had truly changed. It wouldn't be easy. He knew that. She no longer trusted him, and rightly so. Sarah, on the other hand, was grappling with her own internal conflict. Since the day Thomas had appeared at her door, something in her heart had started to shift. No matter how much she tried to convince herself that she shouldn't give him another chance, a part of her wanted to believe in his sincerity. Thomas made a decision. He knew he needed to step out of his comfort zone and risk something that would show not just Sarah, but the world that he was committed. And so, a plan began to take shape. That morning, Sarah received an unexpected invitation. It was a simple envelope with her name written by hand, but the handwriting was unmistakable. I'd like you to be there tonight. I don't want to pressure you, but it's important to me. Thomas. She hesitated, but curiosity and the different tone of his words convinced her. When she arrived at the address indicated in the invitation, Sarah was surprised to find a public garden transformed. The once simple location was now filled with flowers, soft lights, and freshly painted benches. A small stage had been set up in the center, surrounded by curious onlookers from the neighborhood. Sarah walked slowly, unsure of what was happening, until she saw Thomas on the stage. He was wearing simple clothes, Something unusual for him, but it made him seem more human. "Good evening," Thomas began, his voice echoing through the microphone. "First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here." He took a deep breath, clearly nervous, something Sarah had never seen in him before. "There's something I need to say, and I want to do it as honestly as possible," he continued, looking directly at Sarah, who was now in the front row, confused and emotional. "For most of my life, I believed I could control everything, that people and situations were pieces I could move to achieve my goals. And because of that, I made terrible mistakes." The crowd was silent, and Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. "But then I met someone who made me realize that life isn't a transaction," Thomas said, his eyes locked on hers. "Sarah, you showed me that there's strength in authenticity, that I don't need to hide my flaws to be worthy of something real." He paused, summoning the courage to continue. "I wronged you. I was selfish, arrogant, and blind to everything you represented. But now, all I want is a second chance. Not to fix what I've done. I know I can't erase the past. But to build something real from here on." Sarah felt tears stream down her face, unable to hold back the wave of emotions overwhelming her. "This garden," Thomas gestured around them. "It's where we first met. Not literally, but this is how you came into my life, with simplicity, beauty, and strength. I want it to be a symbol of what we can build together." The crowd began to applaud, but Sarah could barely hear it. Her hands trembled, and she could hardly move as Thomas stepped off the stage and walked toward her. "I know I can't ask you to forgive me easily," he said, now face to face with her. "But if you give me the chance, I promise to do everything I can to be the man you deserve." For a moment, Sarah was silent, processing everything. Finally, she took a deep breath and replied, "Thomas, you hurt me in ways I can't even explain, but something has changed. You've changed, and if this is real, maybe we can try." Thomas's smile was immediate, but there was a humility in his expression that showed he knew he would need to fight for her every day. That night, as they walked together through the garden, Sarah felt that for the first time they were beginning to build something real. Thomas had let go of his pride, and she was willing to give him a second chance. It wouldn't be easy, but both of them knew they were ready to try. The sun shone brightly over the newly renovated garden of the Brown mansion. What was once merely a decorative part of the estate now symbolized so much more: Thomas and Sarah's fresh start. The scent of flowers filled the air, mingling with Sarah's soft laughter as she lounged on a deck chair, gently caressing her visibly pregnant belly. Thomas sat beside her, a serene expression on his face, something rarely seen before. He held a book about parenting, something he had recently begun reading, an act that months ago would have been unthinkable for a man who once lived solely for work and power. "You look more nervous than I am," Sarah teased, watching the anxious way he flipped through the pages. "I want to be prepared," he replied with a faint smile. "I've made too many mistakes to risk not doing this right." Sarah reached out and gently squeezed his hand. "The fact that you care already says so much, Thomas. Our child will be lucky to have you as their father." Her words brought an unexpected warmth to Thomas's heart. He knew he still carried the weight of his past mistakes, but he was determined to be a better man, not just for Sarah, but for himself and the child about to be born. A few days later, the calm that had enveloped their lives was replaced by frantic commotion. Sarah went into labor in the middle of the night, and despite all his preparations, Thomas couldn't hide his initial panic. He called the doctor while rushing her to the hospital, gripping her hand tightly the entire way. "Breathe, Sarah. Everything's going to be fine," he said, trying to reassure her, though his own voice shook. "I am breathing," she shot back, her tone a mix of pain and irritation. "You should try doing the same." When they arrived at the hospital, time seemed to move in slow motion for Thomas. The image of Sarah lying in the delivery room, fighting to bring their child into the world, was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Hours later, the sound of a newborn's cry filled the air. Nathan had arrived. The doctor handed him to Thomas, who stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe he was holding his son. He looked over at Sarah, exhausted but smiling, and felt something he had never experienced before. Pure, genuine happiness, completely free of ambition or ego. "He's perfect," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, as he gently placed the baby in Sarah's arms. In that moment, everything made sense to him. What once seemed to be the center of his life, control, success, revenge, now felt insignificant compared to the family he had formed. In the months that followed, Thomas began adjusting his life to prioritize Sarah and Nathan. He delegated responsibilities at work, something he had once considered impossible, and structured his schedule to ensure he was home every evening. Sarah, in turn, found a balance between her new life as a mother and her own dreams. With Thomas's support, she started a small landscaping business, something she had always dreamed of but never had the opportunity to pursue. Rebecca, realizing she had permanently lost Thomas's attention, quietly disappeared from their lives. Her last attempts at manipulation were met with cold indifference, and she finally accepted that there was no longer a place for her in Thomas's story. One peaceful afternoon, Thomas and Sarah strolled through the garden, Nathan cradled in Thomas's arms. The baby stared at the flowers with curiosity, while Sarah smiled as she watched Thomas point out each one as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. "Who would have thought you'd be so good with flowers?" Sarah teased, resting her head on Thomas's shoulder. "It's not about the flowers," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "It's about what they mean to us." The garden, once a symbol of a relationship forged in self-interest, was now a space filled with genuine love and redemption. To Thomas, each flower represented a choice he had made to change. To Sarah, they were a reminder that even the most complicated stories could blossom into something beautiful. As the sun set, they sat together on the grass, Nathan asleep in Sarah's arms. "Do you think he'll love flowers?" she asked softly. "He'll love them because he'll learn from the best," Thomas replied with a smile. Sarah looked at him, seeing not the arrogant, calculating man she had once known, but someone who had chosen to grow, to change, and to love. Their life wouldn't be perfect, but now they knew they had the strength to face any challenge together. Nathan was more than a new beginning. He was proof that even after the fiercest storms, there was always a chance for something new to bloom. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.